Seeds of Hope is a podcast created on the Lekwungen territory, represented today by Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. We feature special edition episodes at Shianu territory and shared Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh land. As uninvited guests, we hold with immense gratitude and respect the privilege it is to share and cultivate a climate-conscious community here on what we colonially refer to as Vancouver Island. Hi, I'm your host, Claire Marshall, and welcome to the Seeds of Hope Climate Storytelling Podcast. I'm going around my community to chat with folks who are passionate about all things climate, from advocating for more sustainable environmental practices to enhancing well-being through arts-based activities. For today's episode, we're heading over to speak with Lucas Olscamp, educator and artistic director at Pearson College. Lucas dedicates their time to teaching youth how to foster empathy and encourage climate action through performing arts.
I'll just start by saying, Lucas, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Lucas Olscamp. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I come from Abegwit, or so-called Prince Edward Island on the east coast of Canada, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. But very happy to welcome you here to Pearson College, United World College campus, which is on the traditional territory of the Shauna-Beecher Bay First Nation, and welcome you into the kind of kooky, weird, hybrid, entangled world of kind of climate ecology and art that I kind of find myself in. I'm a teacher, artist, I guess. I work a lot, self-proclaimed. But I work a lot in the kind of intersections of kind of art and ecology. My role here on the campus is really to be, first I started teaching in the theater department in visual arts, and recently with the founding of our Climate Action Leadership Diploma, which I know we'll come back to, I started kind of embarking on that program to develop my own curriculum around kind of how to foster empathy through non-traditional forms of narrative that are not just solely in the realms of science and kind of engineering and mathematics around climate, and how students can find different ways that speak to them, that can speak to others like them in the world to make them feel more empathetically and form kinship around community in the human and non-human world.
That is such a beautiful introduction. Wow.
Weave that one in.
Blown me away. That is so wonderful. So I'm very curious, and we've also had the pleasure and joy of speaking with with several people that work in this kind of like intersection of arts and climate. And I just am wondering if that's something that you found naturally, or is it kind of like an area where you were like, I am really passionate about arts and theater, performance, whether that's also like I think you mentioned a little bit of visual arts as well. Like, did you find it easy to combine climate and like ecology and environmental aspects into what like your interest and passion was in theater? Or was that something you kind of were like, I need to make this space?
I think it's a little bit of both. I would say I find it, I don't know if I find it easy, but I definitely found it really fascinating to deal with. I feel like the sides of ecology and art that were often, let me break it this way. And that is that I've watched so much. If you had to look up, like climate and theater or climate and art, for a long time, I would argue that, not trying to undermine the incredible work of so many artists out there, but there was something about it that I argued that often was quite shallow. There was, often these kind of plays about save the whales, and like artworks about like drowning oceans, and there was like something where I just found like the narrative was caught in the kind of what was most iconic and what was most kind of like archetypal around the stories of climate. And where I found my interest in it was that I thought there were so many things I was already passionate about that I believe were entangled in the work of climate and ecology that are not going to be the first like pop-up Google search when you're kind of looking for climate and art. So for me, like, growing up, I was obsessed with monstrosity. Like, I love monsters. And I just find monsters deeply fascinating. And I think before I ever connected them to climate, monsters were woven throughout all of my work, and especially as a young theater artist. And I was obsessed with, monsters as icons of queer community, as icons of the other, as kind of signifiers. And then it was only when I was like diving deeper and deeper into this that I realized that like often monsters were also embodiments of the natural world. Often they were, in so many stories, I found them to be these kind of natural forces, often hybrid forces with kind of the non-human world that were like speaking back to humans or fighting back against the kind of destructive forces like Godzilla as a metaphor for like nuclear war kind of things, and then Frankenstein as a figure of the science and how it's affecting the natural order. And I think it was those stories that I was following first that were about the monster and the other that slowly I found myself weaving into things like concepts of kinship, things like concept of community, concepts of like entanglement. And I think from that's where I started to realize like, oh, maybe this is like a climate, a way for students and young people to also, can they have their other kind of gateways and ways to access climate storytelling and climate education that are quote unquote the kind of alien doors or other doors that are not just, I don't know, yes, save the whales, but
STEM, marine biology.
Yeah, exactly. Like the kind of classic graph chart of, inconvenient truth of like going off of, this is the carbon footprint. And I just don't feel like people were actually, art has that way of drawing empathy into people where I feel like those other fields do have that power, but I think they struggle to.
Would you say that like monsters were like, you weren't afraid of them?
No, I never. I think I've definitely been, it was interesting knowing that I should be afraid of them. I feel like, I constantly had that idea that they are other, you know what I mean? They're supposed to be so, but they're so, supposed to be repulsive, and yet they're so attractive in the sense that they kind of draw you in. And I found myself, I found that it's like you can't look away from a car crash. Like you can't it's this kind of like these monsters demand attention. Like they demand to be seen, they demand to be heard, they demand to be faced. And I think often when I ask my students, I think that it's less about the monster being quote unquote evil or bad. It has purpose. It has intention. There's very few monsters that exist in narratives that don't have an intention or a desire, and often if you and the ones you would argue that say they don't have that, I think are the most misunderstood. And I found that I just really drew to their stories because I said, like if I can see myself in that, then there's also a great power in that, because monsters have the power to break binaries, they have the power to break traditional narratives, they have the power to also like completely consume humanity. And I think that was something that was overwhelmingly attractive in the sense that I really was drawn into it. And I found that a lot of my early stories in that I was working in theater, especially as a young director and playwright, really focused on the monsters. I think particularly the Minotaur was something that was a creature that like haunted a lot of my works for a while. And my full undergrad thesis was just like, that the icon of the Minotaur it's just super omnipresent throughout the show. And I find myself still today, often, it's rare that my show doesn't have a monster in some sense, even if it's an unseen or seen force. But I feel like often I'm still trying to live in kinship with the kind of, with the alien, with the other, with the kind of queered, entangled creature.
And would you find that climate played a role in that from early on too? Or is that something that you've kind of seen? Because looking back now, I'm really identifying like movies that I've watched. Even like I used to have like I went through a big horror movie phase when I was like very early stages of my queerness. I would like put that back to grade 6, 7, and 8. I was big into horror movies. They helped me feel alive. And I'm realizing now, that there is that kind of theme of like the environment and climate. Like one horror movie in particular, I can't think of the name, but like all of the town is consumed like by this water that gets like this, everyone gets this illness that they all start killing. It's called the Crazies, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a really wild one. Yeah. And it's all because like a human overpopulation is like taking space and not allowing like biodiversity to thrive. And so this biodiversity like created this illness that like makes people kill each other. So anyway, like did you start making that natural connection to kind of like climate and those kind of stories like in undergrad or like even before that, or was that always kind of part of what you were doing, or is that a recent development?
I honestly don't think it was that conscious when I was young. I think I was very conscious. I think monstrosity on a very surface level for when I was young. I think I was then very conscious of the kind of connection to identity, I think, around like kind of queerness in my undergrad. And I think it was not until I did my master's at York, and it was there, I think, that I did technically the degree is, an MFA in design, but it's almost, they kind of, in many ways, it's an MFA in sustainable design, or kind of looking at sustainable, what are more ecological awareness towards kind of design practices. And I remember even there, I kind of struggled a lot with like this stereotype of just like, oh, well, ecological design is just the same show, but just doing shows with like less harmful materials and stuff. And one of the examples that was given to me was plastic bags. They were like, yeah, like, you know, like plastic and plastic materials, like plastic bags. The same way we're trying to rid plastic bags from our kind of economy, that's like in theater, how can we rid ourselves of these plastic materials? And I don't know what I was in, of just like in a troublemaking kind of mode. But I found myself that there was such, I don't know, kind of like the idea that you would just like push the evil away, push this thing away. Like the idea that plastic is this horrible thing that's destroying our environment. And the way to face that is just to remove it from the narrative, to just completely bring it out. Versus I kind of retaliated back in my work really to say, I think that it's actually, we should face that monster. I said, so what if I said, instead of getting rid of plastic bags, I said, what if my show is just plastic? Like, what if it's just all plastic? And what does it mean to face that kind of thing that we have made? Like the same way we've made monsters, we've made plastic, we've made these toxins that have destroyed our earth. And I think it was there that the threads started entangling and started kind of weaving. And I realized that, oh, this is similar. I think that we are trying to villainize a thing we birthed. You know, that climate change is something that's beyond us and greater than us, but it is of us. And so I think when I realized that, and in my work, I think that's when things got entangled, things got kind of woven together, and then quickly I think that's carried with me ever since, where I realized the kind of ecological, you don't need to do a climate show for you to be talking about ecology or kind of things, because I think like we all live in climate. And so it's just funny that I feel like people have tried to put things in genres, like a topic, versus to say, like, you know, any show can be about climate. It doesn't have to be a show that's about the whales. I think in some ways, you know, just a show about family dynamics that are grappling with anxiety of change can be a climate show. I think in so many ways, a queer family dealing with kind of otherness can be a climate production. And so that's one thing to say and to believe. It's very different to try and teach that to young people. And so I think that's where I'm living in that space right now, is trying to say, like, how can I not, you know, bring that out in young people, where it doesn't have to be just in theater or monsters, but I say, like, what is your story, and what is the story in connection to your shared environment, and how can we explore that? What form can that take?
Did you feel like academia was like a safe space for these kind of conversations? And that, I don't know, I think it could go either way, and probably depends on where you're studying, but I know that for some universities, like those kind of bigger conversations, and like when you're like, oh, actually, like you're teaching this not all wrong, but like you're not considering this really big other part, and like you're also like kind of perpetuating the problem. Did that feel like an easy conversation to have? Again,
I don't know if it was easy. I think it was definitely a good conversation to have. I found it very, like, you know, challenging for folks to and also I was very naive too. Like, I was going into it like, I don't know what this is, but I just know that there's something to shake this up. And I think I was not the first, and have not been the last, you know, to realize there's so many artists out there that are shaking that space up, that really are, again, that's where I argue, like, there's so many folks who have been doing artworks about climate, and artworks that are dealing with this, that have not been capital T, or, you know, like theater, capital C, climate theater, you know, kind of shows. And so I think that academia was it felt like a good space to do it, but it often, I argue, was a good space to do it on paper. And then when you try to do it in practice, people had a lot more issue with it. They said, like, oh, that's all great and dandy for a thesis, but like, you can't just, what does that mean on the larger scale? What does that mean for the kind of like economy of theater? And that's where I started to feel less and less like I wanted to be in the kind of economy side of theater. And that's kind of where producing large scale shows and kind of grappling with that kind of complexity of how to produce those shows in ecological ways, and instead kind of shifted myself more towards education, because I found that's where I found theater most potent for me and most powerful for me as a tool to help young people grapple with questions rather than find the easy answers and solutions.
And so after you mentioned doing your MFA, is that how you ended up coming here to where we are today?
I was, so during my MFA, I was very very privileged to be able to form my own company called Tooth and Fang. So it was this kind of arts company that was really devoted to exploring wildness as a concept. And so our shows have no coherent through line other than wildness, I would say, to some level. And it was that the kind of, I was working with Tooth and Fang, traveling around. I was in Costa Rica. And then I was just supposed to come back for 3 months to volunteer at the college. And January 2020. And then the world quickly collapsed, kind of soon months into that. And it was just, I think the stars were aligned and everything was here. And I was offered the opportunity to take on teaching here full time. And it's just been an incredible gift. I mean, I wouldn't wish teaching anything, let alone especially teaching the arts and theater in climate, like running, rehearsals with laptops as like scene partners and trying to give emotional cue work with people with masks on, was some of the greatest challenges I faced. But I think from that, incredible work was coming out. I think in some of the shows we've been doing at the college the last few years, I think have incredibly dealt with kind of, that entanglement of empathy and deep stories, not just the shallow ones, and that deal with climate in ways that are more nuanced, I think. Yeah.
That's so special. I want to see a performance.
Come.
Yeah. I want to. Where do you see them advertised? Or like, how do you advertise to the...
I don't do any public advertising. Okay. I think it's interesting. I mean, our student body alone fills the theater.
Really?
so it's quite...
I was going to say, if it's international, like, I guess you wouldn't have a lot of families that come to these... Well, maybe, but...
No, sometimes if they're local, but most of our productions, I am anti-technology when it comes to shows. Like, I love sound, I love lights, but sometimes a projector. But I'm anti-mics, I'm anti-cameras, and so the students have this desire.
Hide the camera.
I know, right? Shut them all down. But I always tell my students, like, you can film it, but I will not be responsible. And I always joke with them, like, the theater gods hate technology, and that we have to like pay our kind of owns to them. And so the students do record it. I've never watched a recorded version of the shows, but there is recorded versions of kind of out there and stuff. But we often just do one show, like one night. We do a performance night, and it's kind of, in that way, it's kind of, there's something that I love about theater that is so different from other art forms like film and photography, where it's just like, it just lives in the ephemera. It just lives, it's in that moment and then it's gone. It just ceases to exist. And I think that I've tried so many other art forms, but I think theater does something. I think theater is, hot take. It's just, I think it's just one of the most it is, I think, the most human of the arts. I think it's just because it's just existing. It's just, you are, yes, it could be pre-scripted, doesn't have to be, but I think you are just a human body existing in live time in front of someone. I think music is very similar, I think, in that ways, but anything that is live performance is just, does something to the soul that is so different. Not to say it's any more powerful, I think, than things like film and other art forms, but it's so different.
It's a moment you're living in, I feel like, versus, I mean, I really love film. I love theater too. I've been a film nerd for a long time, but I never really performed in film, but I have done theater, and like, it's like a little, I guess it depends on how close you are, but it can't, for me, at least in high school, it was very much like a little family for a while, like a unit, like a family unit that you were kind of living in, and that was like all you cared about for 2 to 3 months, and then goodbye.
Which I think is like weird on a small scale, but on a larger repeated scale, an act of climate resilience. Like, I think theater or film production, like, I think the form of collaborative art making is a forming of community, of temporary community, and I think it's so. There's sometimes maybe, I'm not a scientist, but I know maybe there are research, groups that come together that maybe share. I don't know if they share that same sense of family and kind of sense, but I think that like sometimes that's the kind of even the underbelly of the underbelly. Kind of talking about, like, you can have a show that's talking about climate, or a show that's nuancing around climate, or just looking at the act of making theater as a form of forming community. And if communities are more resilient, if folks feel like they can be more vulnerable, if they feel like they are being witnessed and being seen and being heard, I think that those folks, I argue, are often more resilient going out into community, and arguably more resilient to face things like climate disaster, when they feel like what happens in those moments of response where community is tested or forced upon people, in response to like flooding or earthquakes. And I think what happens when you have groups of people that have already had temporary community, and I think I don't know. That's my I'd hope, and I think there's people that are doing it even more. That I think that are really out that are not just in an insular sense that we're on campus, but are out in the community. But I hope that our students from all around the world are going home and carrying a little bit of that, I don't know, theater kid.
I hope so. Absolutely.
Yeah.
If there's one thing I remember learning from theater is just and I think it's something I miss in my years since being involved in theater, is just how much you have to learn to trust other people that you're working with, whether it's your tech crew or your actual and not coworkers, but co-leads, or how do you say people you're performing alongside, that act of being they'll get me through to the next scene. That's something I definitely don't have in my my older, soon to be 30s.
Seeking that.
Pardon?
Seeking that now, or did you find yourself wanting that out?
Yeah, now, I feel in my older 20s, I've just started and especially with COVID and how crazy the world can be just is.
Yeah, is. Always was and always will be. Yeah.
I've lost a bit of this trust that the people I'm performing alongside are showing up, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Not my direct friends or family, coworkers. I do see people showing up, but just I have a lot more trust issues, I feel than I used to have whenever I did feel really, I think that's also growing up a little bit.
Yeah.
Just a little bit, but I definitely had that more starry-eyed whenever I was doing more performing arts and involved in community theater and things like that.
I just also that sense of radical vulnerability that people make fun of in young theater kids, I think, but is so vital and so rare. I think the older and older you get, I find that it's harder to find people who will just throw themselves at embarrassment, and I think that's something I teach my kids all the time, is you have to be embarrassed. They're what is the some young kids believe that the key to confidence is just that they will one day be unafraid completely, on stage. And I was that's not a reality, or a rare reality maybe for some. I said but I think instead I think it's knowing that you're deeply embarrassed and being in that and sitting inside of that. And I think that is something that all people should have as a skill. I think if you are being okay with, not knowing something, being okay with doing something wrong, not knowing if you're doing it right, but also it's one thing to bear witness to that on your self-reflection every day, but it's very different with an audience of folks who you have to bear, who are watching. But honestly, all community is audience. And so I think that in any days, every action we take, there's people watching. And I think that some people who have a lot of power in the kind of structures and politics of community could do with more embarrassment, and to grapple with that in order to understand that, we need more theater kids in politics. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. That's really true. I think the world would be a bit of a better place if we had that.
A kookier place.
Press
conferences would be a very different musical style entrance, but
I'd be a big fan of that.
Yeah.
It feels like a kookier place for the worse right now. I want it to be that, but for the better. And so I'm all in for having more theater kids and arts kids, voting them in office and getting people in local.
Politics is already acting, so it's just another.
True.
It's just this also.
That is so true. That is so true.
The theater is already there. But,
yeah. That's really even you saying that, I'm I need to go audition for community theater now, because I am very adverse to embarrassment. And I'm also that I'm still that kid that's when will I not be afraid? Even podcasting, I'm that was scary.
this is this is very being out, being there's an audience bearing witness.
Yeah, exactly. That feels at least every single time for me, there's a point where I want to say for in good way disassociate, in terms of my body's just you just have to do it. Just go do what you got to do. But in a good way, because I know that that's really I'm protecting myself, and I'm you can get through that which makes you afraid. There's a really good quote that's everything that you. I saw this on a graphic design YouTuber that I really loved, and it was everything that you're afraid of is in a cave, or in the dark in a cave. I don't know. It sounded better, way better in the actual quote.
Yeah.
But it goes back to monsters.
Yeah.
And there's things that you're afraid of is where the answer kind of lies.
Totally. Yeah.
So I really love that. I feel very drawn to that. Okay, so I'm very curious, just to rein it back in a little bit.
Pull us back in.
But just pulling us back into your work here in school. So you're very involved with theater. getting youth to perform, be vulnerable, which is such a key part of like development and something we're often like not asked, I guess, to do. Like as youth, like it's something that can be really hard in home lives to like express that vulnerability. So it's really important to do that through various art forms like theater. And I'm just curious how here at this school, how does like climate play into it? I know you mentioned that you have this really exciting like program here, right? The Climate
Action Leadership Diploma.
Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so we're very privileged, a few years ago for a group of really dedicated folks to kind of come together to look at, I wouldn't say, not the term alternative education or alternative pathways, but we call it a parallel pathway. The idea that we could have, here at Pearson College, we run the International Baccalaureate program. So it's an international kind of education body that has many different programs, but one of the ones that they run is the diploma program. So that is what all of our students up until the formation of the college were taking. And that is like a very diverse, wide spectrum, that is to say you're taking, your first language, a second language, a mathematics, a science, a human science, maybe elective, you're taking an art, and you're doing other kind of qualifications. And so this parallel pathway that we were able to kind of co-create or kind of adapt is called the career program from the International Baccalaureate. And we were able to form this kind of Climate Action Leadership Diploma, which takes a select number of students from our college and then really allows them to still take opportunity to take courses from the diploma program, but then half of their entire curriculum is devoted to climate education. So they spend half of their time here at the college in multiple different courses, really kind of grappling with climate in both scientific and community ways, in cultural ways, and political ways, and economic ways. And then for 1 year, was it 1 year? Yeah, 1 year this ran when I was not a part of the program yet, but I was deeply watching, very intently from this side. And I was just teaching theater and teaching visual art. And it was really, I approached the director at the time, Emily Coolidge, who's an incredible, just like pioneer of kind of innovative forms of education. And I really just said, I want to be in this. Like, what can I do? And she said, well, we have this part of the program, we don't really have like a select area for you to do the arts, but we have this thing called personal and professional skills. It has some qualifiers and a structure and a kind of set somewhat curriculum. They said, but what are personal and professional skills for students if they want to pursue a career in climate action? And so because it's a career program, like the focus of that we were developing is like half of our course load to be devoted to forming a career in climate action and leadership. So our program is we do evaluate in many different ways, but one of the core ways we evaluate our students is through core competencies. So it's this competency model where they have 3 different levels and kind of a whole set of competencies. And we kind of look at things like critical self-location, things like conflict management, and are able to facilitation, scientific literacy. I love this form of and what was interesting for our competency model is that we evaluate and the students self-evaluate. So they really are advocating themselves for what level they are at these. So they come into like emergent and like make their way kind of like all the way up to more kind of like critically present, kind of engaging enacting of these competencies and skills. And so I had the great privilege of developing my own curriculum where they said, like, how could I take the personal professional skills curriculum and really adapt it to something that would work for me? So I formed, we love an acronym. So I formed like the NEST, which stands for Narrative, Ecology, Selfhood, and Thinking, or Teaching. And the NEST was meant to be kind of, like as it sounds, like an incubator space and a space for students to really engage in, okay, like, yes, I could just like, lead a class and like how to like have these basic skills and competencies, but instead, how do I make it project based? So they engage in a series of incredibly multidisciplinary projects that really get them to grapple with climate and ecology and empathy and kinship in different modes that are actually very few of them are theater. Like they're actually, but many of them, one of the projects takes on looking at kind of observational poetry and kind of field guide kind of creation. Another looks at object curation and the idea idea of how we kind of collect and build narratives, looking at like comparative things to like the Voyager Records series, which is like an archive of images, and we kind of critique it and look at like how do we tell the narrative of humanity and our relationship to the world. And then we have things like architecture of resilience, things like ethics of documentary, and other kind of course, monsters. We have monsters and monsters of climate and mask making. And in each of these projects, they really are faced with, having to use a mode of communication and a mode of storytelling that is arguably just so out of the norm, quote unquote, the tradition of like, let me show you a graph, let me show you the data, let me show you what was happening, which is one way to argue climate narratives, and sometimes very powerfully, but how can we complicate that? And so I think that what I find is students are, grappling with that, sitting with that, and it ends up becoming this like multimodal kind of art curation, experiential class that we do mostly on the land. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Has there been anything that surprised you the most from this work, or like any moment where you felt even like the most proud of kind of seeing what young people or youth are making when it comes to their thoughts on like climate? And
I know we're coming back full circle to monsters, but I think that there's something about the monster making project where for the core of it, the project just is quite simply ask them to develop their own ecological monster of some form, and giving it kind of purpose connected to their own local communities, and why that monster should not be something only to be feared, but something that is a teacher. So that monster has something to show, has something to say, has something to teach, and they have to then create that monster, but then create the narrative of that monster that they want to share, and then they have to create it in a mask. So they form these kind of like the medium of that mask is up to them, but then we gather around by fire at night. And last year we had the great like serendipitous privilege of the power shutting off on campus that night. And there was just this something like beautifully serendipitous of just like very ancient of like the whole campus went dark. And it was just pitch black, and we had this roaring fire, and a group of these students, representing, I think amongst them, like 9 different countries, that are sitting around a fire, each with these beautifully crafted handmade masks, and just stepping up, in front of each other and just storytelling and sharing these kind of stories. And I think I've just been so captivated by the simple, evocative nature of that. Like the idea that it was just kids around a fire, and yet from that is just incredible nuance, incredible empathy, incredible complexity around students talking to historical, cultural narratives, talking to like economic kind of like infrastructures as kind of like monstrous creatures, and how they're just dealing with their own passions and communities and folklore, and weaving that in as a way to share with others. And then and also bringing back the oral storytelling, but bringing back a way of having to not be an essay, not be a presentation, but having to evoke empathy from others to make us be drawn into the story. Every year it gets me. Like, I do it, and it's just like, I'm like, that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like this really speaks to some of the biggest monsters we like have in our lives are the ones that we don't face, right? And so to give them this like language and time to think about it in a deeper, more meaningful way, that they get to like actually even be in control and like construct the narrative. I bet that's really, really powerful. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say like one of the other ones I was just thinking of that this year was so fascinating just because it was so different in the forms was like, one of my favorite parts around my curriculum is just not, other than like setting like it has to be a mask or setting it has to be a storytelling, it's just like leaving it really open for interpretation. Like what is a mask to you? What is what mode did that make? And then so one of the projects we do is called speculative cartography, where they have to like look into the future, and they have to take a particular region that is hopefully close to them in some way. It could be their local community, or I could choose one around the world, and they have to imagine it like, hundreds, if not thousands of years into the future, and look at a dystopian vision and a utopian vision. And then they have to create a map, quotation marks, of like how could you map that? What would that look like? And we kind of do this thing called counter mapping, where we're meant to try and decolonize ways of how traditional maps hold so much power over different people around the world, particularly how colonization has affected our understanding of, what a map can do in power. And so, I said you have to make a map, but two of our students brought us down in a kind of silent meditation down to the docks and engaged and like dropped a microphone underneath the water, and we engaged in this like eyes closed, like imaginative map of space. You know, one of our students ended up taking us on a walk out to the soccer field where we all had to be blindfolded and navigate the terrain as they like talked about a dystopian rural like community in like northern Mongolia or Russia, I believe. Like, wow. And I think suddenly I was just surprised that I think students are hungry for the capacity to let imagination take them, not just like, how can I be creative with this project, but actually like, how can I blow open how I tell this story and how I tell and go into that. And I think that's actually the underbelly of of what I want students to be getting at is like the content, awesome, whatever you choose to do, but I just want them to find that for themselves. Like, what's your form? What's your way of blowing open the way of storytelling that's going to bring people in the way that you want to bring them in?
It's almost like inviting them to play.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's like a sense of play is so vital. I think like letting them, and I think that it's still crazy to me how much curriculum is so binding, like how we still don't have the ability to let students play, the ability to let students interpret. You know, I love when students try and clarify. You know, they're like, okay, but like, what do you mean? Like, do you want it to be like this? And I was like, I don't know. Like, how do you feel? Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm like, however you think, like K but map? Like, you know, like K but like poem? Like, what do you mean? Like, can my poem be this? And I was like, yeah, totally. Like, you know, I had a student present a poem that was just like an amalgamation of like materials on the floor of the space. And it was like, that's the poetry. And I was like, yes. You know, thank you. Like, thank you for bringing that to us. Like, yeah.
That's amazing. I feel like,
go
ahead.
Go.
I was just going to say, I feel like I'm that student that I'm like, teacher, like, can you give me some clear details here? Because we're so used to that. We're not used to being told, I don't know, maybe some people that have, especially if they have more like arts, kind of artistic parents, like maybe they're used to being invited to think about things in a bigger picture way like that. But I was raised by a mom who has her doctorate in education, and a teacher at that. So and you know, and that also goes to speak for how structured classrooms are expected to be in places like where I grew up in Louisiana, where there's like certain curriculum and classroom narratives that you have to follow. And so I very much have that background of like, I want to know what you're asking me, but like there's such a power in being like, do what you want, what feels right, because we have such this like construct that not always like our emotions or like ideas can fit into. Well,
that's something so often emotions just can't fit into, I think, a lot of educational spaces. And I feel like, you know, I think that's something I've also struggled with is like constantly, it's like, you know, like how do you teach kids about climate without devastating them? You know, and I think that how do you make them feel, you know, and yet we go deeper than that. We go to a level, you know, of like, you know, we talk about apocalypses and, you know, and the ends of worlds, and how for some the narrative growing up around climate has been the end of the world. The end of the world is coming. And then we complicate that by bringing in perspectives, which are lived experiences of some of our students and also other older, you know, for a time that are the idea that people have lived through apocalypses. You know, the idea that is a privilege to think that the end of the world has not already happened. There has been several ends of worlds. And I think that to talk about the death of languages, the death of Indigenous peoples, the death of, you know, of cultures, of ways of being, the idea that worlds have ended. And so I think that it's humbling sometimes to realize that, you know, to realize that doesn't make it any less scary, like any less devastating, but it makes the students constantly start to think around, you know, what is it to live in an apocalypse, and what is it to live in an approaching end. And I'm trying to remember, I can't remember it right now, but it'll come to me right after. But there's this incredible piece of like talking about performance art and climate. There's this incredible piece that was, I think, premiered. But it was performed at the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago or a while back. And it's this opera. And it's an opera where I think the audience comes up and is in this pavilion. And you're looking down, and the entire production is this hyper-realistic recreation of like a slice of a beach. And it's just like, it's all sand, and then and there's this beaming kind of lights down on the stage, and all the performers are dressed like just hyper-realistic folks going to the beach and enjoying the sun in the summer, and they're all just sprawled across the beach. And then the project invites others to come and be able to participate, and you can just like, you know, lay on the beach and enjoy, and like, you know, they have kids playing games, and they have like people tanning and stuff, like, you know, and they're singing, and they start to, and then from this, the singers erupt, but they never break the kind of routine naturalism of just being present on this beach. And I love that because I think it was the director or someone else speaking to it, but that's climate change. They said like that's what it looks like. So many people are looking for the image of the earth on fire, like the idea, this apocalyptic vision of end of the world, the sci-fi version of it, the monstrous version of it. But often like climate change is laying on the beach and the sun being hotter, a little bit hotter. It's so subtle, it's so simple, and I think that there's something powerful about that, about reminding folks about that it's just that the changes have already been happening, already are happening. The apocalypse is already here, and the apocalypse doesn't always look like the atom bomb for it to be as devastating. It's sometimes it's way subtler and sinister of how it's affecting people and cultures in different ways, and I think that's where I start to get some real complex out of the students when they start to realize like, oh, I don't have to have lived through a flood to talk about how my community is being affected in other ways. Like our languages are being affected actually by this, our indigenous forms of governance are being affected by this, but that is as, devastating as a climate event, as is an earthquake, as is a flooding.
So many people are afraid of what may be, and also a lot of people are afraid of climate, and I think it ties into a lot of like climate eco-anxiety that youth particularly face, knowing that we've got this big long future that we're supposed to grow into and use savings accounts to prepare for whatever is to come, when it feels like so unknown and it feels so much like, we are going over this. It feels like we're going over the hump of like the bad is yet to come. And I mean, in some ways that's very much true. Like we are going to face like really terrible storms, I think, in like our lifetime, if we're lucky and privileged enough to grow old into our lives. Like things will in theory only get sadly worse in terms of like climate. Hopefully things will get better in terms of stability and how we take care of each other. Those don't have to get worse. Those can definitely get better. But it does make me feel more comfortable knowing that like, or even just not knowing, but speculating or thinking that what if it already did end and, we're just here, we're the survivors of it, trying to make peace with it.
Like understand it kind of through that.
Yeah.
I think it's powerful. I think that the idea that the solution to fear of the future is not being unafraid. I think it's fear is fear. I mean, like it will be there. It will always be there. I know I hate when students always argue like, are we living in more uncertain times? There's that quote comes up like, we're living in the most uncertain times. Like no, times have always been uncertain. Like they'll continue to be uncertain. There's no certainty. That's something that I can always argue with my students. There's no certainty to any route of there's no way of history repeating itself, but it also evolves and changes, and so I think that you want to like let people. I don't want students. It can be quite naive as a teacher to think that like my goal is to like make things so hopeful that it'll overshadow the fear, and instead being more human to say, I want to give you tools and things that are going to help you to navigate that, but it doesn't mean it's going to vanish. It doesn't mean it's going to go away, and I think that. And that's, something our students face, which is so hard, is because we're like a capital C climate program in some ways, like that word, so often you hear other youth really self-policing each other and even kind of asking, well, what have you done? Like, what are you doing? Like, why? So these kids, I find them often grappling with like, okay, like, what have I done physically? Like, what can I show for the changes that I've made for my education? And I argue the same thing to say that, like, there's so many young med students that are asked, why haven't you cured cancer? You know what I mean? And yet the young climate kids that are in climate action that pursue a career in that are asked, like, show us what you've done. And I think that, like you said, like sometimes the most radical act is like, well, I formed a more resilient community. Like I brought my community together. I helped, revitalize a language that's been dying from my grandparents. And I've been helping to it's the kind of, that actually that onus that we should be putting on the visible change is not the onus of the individual, it's the onus of the system, it's the onus of the corporation. You know what I mean? Like, why are we demanding teenagers to solve the recycling when it's like there's like capitalist structures that are, yes, they are having creative, imaginative ideas to it, but I think where we need to be investing in youth is investing in their resilience, and resilience is a complex term though, I think, but also investing in their vitality and investing in their community. And I think from there, change will be seen. Change will be felt, I think, more than just seen. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any like nuggets of knowledge or inspiration to like, how do we invest in youth? You know, other than like, you're doing great work, you're working with them, educating them, inspiring them. If you were my theater teacher, I'd be so excited. I feel like that would just be the coolest ever. But other than like education, are there other ways to like, how do we, and even as like, even youth, like how can youth support youth? Do you have ideas on how that, because if, you know, a lot of, our audience, at least like with the Starfish, with the organization I work for, is youth. And so hopefully they're watching this.
Well, my tidbits of advice. Honestly, like listen to them. I think giving young people spaces to be seen and heard in really vulnerable ways, I think is just awesome, whether that's in climate and anything. I think letting it be okay to not know, to be uncertain, to be afraid, to be uncomfortable is really powerful. I think creating spaces for that in young people and you know, be embarrassed and be wrong, and you know, it can happen in any field. I think in any space, you know, with young people. I think that young people shouldn't only be around young people, you know, and I think that's something that, you know, when we're looking at like decolonizing practice, something that I feel like I wish we had more. We have a little bit of taste of, but just like that, having elders, well, you know, Indigenous elders from community, elders from family, just teachers of different generations, folks of different generation, is returning to the fact that sometimes this, really colonial way of just putting 1,000 16-year-olds in the same building and being like, why aren't you all growing? Like, you know what I mean? Like, why aren't you? It's like, no, like, put them in community. Like, you know, like, what are we like? It's just like,
That's the realest thing I've ever heard.
So, you know, like, I was like, bring elders in, bring young people, you know, younger than young people, you know what I mean? Like, I think, you know, in my ideal situation, like teenagers, that, you know, the folks that I'm working with, adolescents, really are surrounded by people of other ages. And it's constantly, I find that, like, as someone who's, like, you know, getting older, not really, you know, like, I'm not very far from the generationally of them, and yet I find being around them teaches me so much. And I think that the fact that there's so many people who don't let young people into rooms of power, and don't let them into spaces of influence, and I think that there's often this, like, you know, I don't know, this cycle, this ritual of ridiculing young people, of ridiculing, like, oh, this is generation, blah, 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 kind of going back. And I think that you have to know that that's always happened. You know, that, like, the same way we are doing it to Gen X, Z, Alpha, whatever, wherever we're going, the same way was done to us, you know, down. Yeah. And I think that and there's something there that's, I don't know where that comes from, but I just feel like I would love to see more spaces where young people are not just in young people spaces. You know, like, I hate, you know, another hot take. I would say not hate, that's a bad word. Hot take is that, you know, like, I don't produce theater for young people. I just produce theater. It has young people in it. Young people are watching. But I'm not doing, like, teen theater, you know, like high school theater. Like, you know, like, I would like to argue that the work that we're doing, the work that these students are doing, whether it's in theater and the climate program, is of the same level I was seeing in my master's. You know what I mean? Like, and I said, like, and there's no reason why the age of a person should define the level of respect that their work and their research and their thoughts and their curiosity gets. And so, I don't know. Bring young people into every space you have. Bring old people into every space you have. Destroy the terms of young and old and just have a spectrum of like spaces. Get rid of age requirements into things, you know, of spaces and programs. And, you know, I think that'd be my biggest kind of advice that I can give. And also just that, and being humble. I think being able to, like, be vulnerable. I think all good teachers know that you have to be a student to be a teacher. And so I think that I'm very, I hope, trying to be more humble in the sense that I don't know a ton of what I'm teaching. I'm just in it. I'm exploring it the same way I'm exploring with my students, and every year I want to be challenged. I want to be provoked. I want to be pushed, and the same thing, I want to do that for them.
That's wonderful. That's a really good answer. Yeah, bringing young folks into, I always think of, you're a musical or you're a theater person. I don't know if you love the musical side of that as much as I do. I love musical theater. But the room where it happens.
Yeah. Exactly.
Do you know this
yes. I do the reference. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Good. Yeah. The room where I just couldn't stop thinking of Aaron Burr being like the room where it happened.
Bring them in.
Which you do see more of these days. It's just what we really have to look out for at the same time is when it's just for show. Yeah.
Like again, like there's these like, you know, youth thing. You know, to say like, oh, we have a sector of our thing that's youth, and that's great, and it can be great. It can be, you know what I mean? But can be, and like, but what you know, what after that? You know what I mean? Like, at what point do you and I think that we're living in a time that is particularly tumultuous around titles and words and things. Like, I would argue that programs with the word climate in it are struggling. I think right now, I think there was a great push for that. I think in the last maybe 10, 15 years, and I'd say now, I would argue there's a dip. There's something happening where I think it's not as, I don't know, you know, that's what happens with like mainstream kind of culture. And I think it was like, it's just not as flashy anymore.
Ebbs and flows.
And it kind of now I worry for young kids where I feel like they get, you know, like even with our program, it's climate action leadership. And so often people just hear the word climate and like the words action and leadership like fall away. And I'm like, you know, I'm like, yes, climate, but I'm like, I'm talking about leadership. I'm talking about just leadership. And I'm talking about that like any ethical, just leader in our world has to be grappling with climate. That's just full stop. And so why does that have to be like, I don't need to put in that word for you to get there. But somehow when people hear that word, they just kind of still, there's an overarching power of like either picket liner, tree hugger kind of stereotype dominates a lot of these young kids, like where I think people like when looking outside into the program. And so I hope that, you know, we can be building spaces where we're grappling with climate and community and futures and uncertainties in equal spaces. We don't need to have that title on top of our programs, and that, you know, to have like a climate youth advisory council. Like it's like you can just have a council. You know what I mean? Like you can and have a council, and yes, it could be youth, and yes, it could be kids about climate, but that doesn't, you know, you don't need to. I don't know. That's just where I'm worried. I'm worried if the pigeonholing is now, if those spaces which are exclusive to those things are now closing, that we haven't woven in those opportunities into the other spaces. And if they're not woven in, if they've just been carved out, they can very easily be chiseled out and filled in.
I also wanted to say, I just think like in terms of bringing young folks into the room where it happens, like, and then we've had really interesting conversation with another guest that we had on one of our podcast episodes that had been a participant at COP, one of the COPs. As you know, there are many COPs. Hard to follow sometimes, but this COP was particularly I think it was in Cairo, Egypt, and like it sounds like it was a really meaningful effort to like bring youth into the conversation, but it's kind of one of those things where like the answer to a leaky bucket isn't putting water into it. It's like plugging in the hole, so like don't set that bucket up for success doing its job. And so very, very key player in terms of like setting youth up for success is like, I think youth get frustrated. We get frustrated if we're not feeling seen or heard, or if like we don't have that same like, I think there's a bit more urgency involved to like a lot of what like youth want to happen, and urgency in itself is an issue with like especially Western colonization and our sense of urgency. I don't think it's very helpful, but I also don't think that it's helpful that a lot of action in climate doesn't have a sense of urgency at the same time, where they're like, we need to make plans on this, but we aren't going to be like doing a day to day, like stopping everything and causing like or implementing transformational climate action, which would just be like, let's change up everything. And youth have the energy to do that because we're young and we're like, why don't we just break apart systems that are failing us? But I think for the people that created those systems, like it's very hard to deconstruct something that you've been told was the right answer.
Yeah, and also like you said, like you talk about the energy. Like, you know what I mean? It's like when youth have such energy and such passion and such, and not to say there's not folks of any age that do, but I think that there's just something around collective young people that have like this like incredible ferocity, and I think that so often, we don't tap into it fast enough. You're like, okay, you're like, oh, you're passionate about climate, like let's get you all, and that's that paradox of like wanting to, like same with our program, we want the kids to have all the skills and competencies and prepare them for a future in this, but also they come in like full of life and energy, and then like quickly the realities of like, okay, like how am I applying to university, what does this actually look like, what is my actually acceptance, that paradox of being like, how can I both transform young people into their best selves to approach an urgent future where they feel they have the capacity and the role and the responsibility to make change, but also do it in a way where they feel like they're protected for like their own self, their own family, their own community. It's like, you can argue that when you are in a place of privilege. It's it's much easier to argue that, to say like do both, what I mean? Like, but it's very different to say, we have students who are incredibly passionate and powerful and devoted to climate action while they're here at Pearson, and then say, well, I'm going back home to be a midwife. You know what I mean? And I'm like, that is climate work. But also I'm like, how can I best ensure that they don't feel like that's any less of change making and any less of that? And how can they, you said, like, how can you still tap into that urgency? Like, how can you have, going back to theater, like I love like a timeline. I love like, we will produce something at this date, and and you start with nothing. And it's like, people will come to see us. And like, what happened? Why don't we have more spaces like that for climate and for change in our communities? Just say, December, the whole community is going to gather around and see it. Like, and
I love that.
And you're like, well, but we haven't pitched it. You're like, I don't know what the project will be, but the date's set.
Right.
They're going to be there that night. So prepare yourself and have something. What I mean? And I think if people, I always tell one little, for my students, I say like, make the poster first. It's like, you're talking about an event, a theater show, a project, like sometimes with Tooth and Fang, I've made posters and pitched and full things out before we even wrote the show. It was like, well, now there's
that makes it real.
There's a show and there's a title. It's gonna be like, it's like, so imagine if we did that with other things and we said like, oh, it's the community solution for our local ecology, and like that's the poster we're putting out into the world, and it's like, you know what, I got to share it at the end of the year.
Yes.
And what is it? Can we gather people around to do that?
That reminds me of a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown. I think it is. It's just about like organizing is believing in the future.
Yeah.
Adrienne said it way better than I did. As always, I'm really bad at re-quoting things. I just like break it apart to like the most basic form.
I love it though.
That really stuck out to me as someone who I organize like Queer Bird Club
here
on Vancouver Island. So just like organizing feels like the most radical form of just like, honestly, whether it's like climate justice or action or even just like community networking, planning and organizing events is such a weird and fun and unique thing to do. Yeah. And it's just always amazing how people show up.
Yeah. I remember trying to think of them. We had an incredible Indigenous elder come into one of our college classes, and I'm similarly, you're talking about quotes, like I'm reducing it down, but just talking about the kind of reverse engineering of community events and how often we, there's a colonial, often, not always, but particularly there's a colonial approach, arguably, to how we plan events where we start with the okay, where are we going to do it? And then now we need the materials, and then how are we going to get the food, and then how are we going to get this thing, and we're leading all the way up to finally the event, and then what will happen, and then how it's responded. And then, he really challenged that when he was talking in our class about kind of reversing that narrative of how do we begin with the impact, what we want. Do we know what we want this night to do? Do we know how we want it to be received? And then let's move back from that. Then who has to be there? Then where is it going to be? Then how will we get there? And then eventually we'll come back all the way to the place and the food and the party and the kind of events and stuff. But if we begin there, but instead, and I think it's so often, it's easy to and it's easy to think you're doing that. I think a lot of us think I know I want this event to do that. But often we're so obsessed with the mechanics of the event that you can have incredible intention, and then just to be like, the event can really not be received that way. It had like, it's like, just because, I've seen some incredible climate coalitions and gatherings that have been meaningful and impactful and intentional. I've seen others that had fancy posters and fancy names and, and fancy ways and big fancy goals. But how that space was held was not reflective of what, it didn't feel real of what change they actually wanted to see.
Yeah.
It just felt like it was easy to check off, like we had a climate conference. I love going back to, just like Coast Salish nations and Indigenous practice and so many Indigenous practices, but around just gathering around food and the idea that, good events, good community has good food. You know what I mean? Like,
Amen
and,
to that.
and it's not a cop out to be like, sometimes there's the corporate side of it where they're like, no, like, but do we really need to, like, you're like, yeah, actually, fundamentally. And like the course that we had here, one of the ones that's Reconciliation is a Global Skill, has where we invite Indigenous elders that we've been working in collaboration with to the campus, is every single class there is food, and they're always making food, and so we turn the classroom into a kitchen, and there's just like, and the idea that you are eating the knowledge, the idea that the consuming of that like helps you, and sometimes I'm just like, it is as simple as that. It's like, do we need a climate conference of youth from all around the world? It's like, yes, but also do we just need like a huge feast? And at that night will be those conversations. Like, and just know that will be, if the right people are invited and they have the right intentions and feelings, you may get far greater impact from the like just not even selling it as that, rather than coming together and there's that anxiety too of like, okay, I love not to say in a kind of like naive, or not naive to say, but like kind of cynical way, is like always like the last gathering or closing of any conference or kind of like big coalition gathering around climate. It's always like, yeah. And
so that was fun.
And that's the world. And so, like, thank you all for coming. And you're just left like, it's not to say we wanted like to see the change, but I just don't know. Sometimes I don't feel like I'm like,
yeah,
we did a lot of talking there, didn't we? Versus like, I don't know. Sometimes I've had more impactful like hikes. Like students were like, we never went into that hike like thinking we were gonna come out of it, and I left like just reeling with like questions and stories and things and fights that we were breaking out on like a hike up one of the mounts here, and I just think so. I don't know. So, but that's the paradox. Like, then how do you both have that serendipity of that and also have the intention of that and have the urgency of that? Like, how do you weave that in? I think that's big question. Yeah.
Very big question. Wow. Yeah, that's a really good way to, I think, bring our little chat to a close here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you all for
I feel moved, actually.
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
these conversations are really important, and I just, similar to what I talked about to some other folks we chatted with in the more like arts-based community. This is like seemingly to me very new, and I mean, it seems like y'all have been doing it all along, and so I feel kind of lonely in the fact that this feels new. But just coming from like a background in biology and then a master's in environmental science, like, my heart had such like a big gap and like ache to where like what I wanted from like learning about the environment and being like an environmentalist or conservation biologist, and like how to put that into practice with how like my inner self also was really drawn to arts and theater and writing and all this, that I kind of was like taught. Well, that's a crow. Or a raven.
One last interruption.
That is really cool. They sound like radar, sonars.
Like
really neat. Yeah, like being from a rural area, there really isn't like, intersection isn't really like a thing, like of anything. There's hardly. There's just like no intersection. Everyone's just like, everyone stay over here. You're a biologist. You should be an accountant. You should be a lawyer. Like very much the way is set out for you rather than like make your own way. And so like coming from rural area and kind of like having that background, it feels really refreshing to, I guess, learn that there are people making like their own way and combining passions that they love, and not just like letting one thing just fall to being like a hobby or something like that, if that makes sense, and like truly bridging what you're passionate about. Yeah, really cool.
Thank you so much for just holding this space, and just love talking. And
Absolutely.
And your Always invited here, like onto
thank
the campus.
You. I have to see a show. I really want to see a show.
Come, yeah.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Seeds of Hope, a climate storytelling podcast. This podcast was hosted and produced by me, Claire Marshall, with Britton McCubbin as our director of photography. We'd also like to extend a special thank you to TELUS STORYHIVE for their production support. Finally, shout out to the Starfish Canada, home of Seeds of Hope podcast, supporting youth-led climate storytelling and leadership across the country. Learn more at www.thestarfish.ca.